Great. So I think we'll just say a few things about Thomas Aquinas, and I think hopefully in the discussion board we got a chance to talk a little bit about Aquinas. He is, by the way, an Italian, and he is somebody who from a really young age decided to enter into being a monk in a monastery, and he ultimately becomes a scholar in a theology school. And so he is somebody, his nickname was like the dumb ox or something like that. He was a big guy and maybe not the sharpest when he was young. So he has all these nicknames, but he writes prolifically, and he is a religious figure, so he has some significance. Even to this day in the Roman Catholic Church, he is canonized as a Roman Catholic saint, so he's not somebody who's like pushing back against the church. In the 1200s, maybe what's really significant about what he tries to do is really develop a way to rectify any conflicts that there might be between some of the ideas that are in the Christian text, and some of these ideas are things like, the notion that there is a God, there's a Trinity, and some other Christian ideals too. Things about bread and wine and miracles and things that some people looked at as really primarily in the domain of faith and not necessarily things that could be quote unquote proven. Aquinas is looking to kind of note how knowledge in the classical texts can be used to kind of prove some of those things. So that's what makes him kind of significant, and he also just serves as a really good model for scholasticism because he's so heavy on Aristotle. He is somebody who just follows almost the way in which Aristotle kind of did some of his writings and use of logic. The use of syllogisms and the way in which he poses his argument is, very much a scholastic exercise. And it is very, very different from humanism, right? If you look at Aquinas's, big takeaway in the 5 ways is basically that, there has to be a God because nothing else could move the very first thing that needed to move, right? So there's this very specialness about, this universal force, that definitely exists. And whether you agree or disagree or find flaws in that argument and whatnot, that's something that lots and lots of modern, philosophers would talk about, right? Looking back at Aquinas. What we're interested in from an historical perspective is really looking at how scholasticism as an exercise and as a style of learning, very rooted in the texts and the discrepancies that are specific between texts and working with the text to kind of nail something that's a little harmonizing. The essence of humanism is very, very different, okay? So in the next discussion post, same discussion, but we'll kind of talk about it a little bit. Let's see as a class if we can come up with how and why humanism is different than scholasticism. And we're going to look at one excerpt to kind of pull this through. The excerpt is written by a female. There were a few women, there are exceptions to some degree, who not only were educated, but also wrote. Christine Pizan, Cassandra Fedeli, there's a few others who are significant and whose writings we know about. Of course, there could be a lot of other women who writings we don't know about, but in this case, we're looking at a graduation speech for a cousin that Cassandra Fedeli gives, and she talks about her own experiences with not only the classical text. She's going to reference Plato, but she also talks about the way in which she uses some of those texts. So look at how she describes humanism, what it seems to be, what seems to be involved in, and how is it that, we can kind of compare humanism and scholasticism. That's what we're really looking to do. Okay, so I'm going to turn off this video, go to the discussion board to help you guys out in understanding that. And then from there, the only thing I'll ask you guys to do from homework after the discussion board is to read one more excerpt. So this is kind of like the third, layer, an additional humanist. So like Cassandra Fedeli and different than Thomas Aquinas. Again, Thomas Aquinas, Middle Ages, Scholastic, 1200s. Cassandra Fedeli and Pico della Mirandola, would be the Renaissance, and Mirandola very early in the Renaissance, and he's responsible for writing the Oration on the Dignity of Man. And some people describe this as like the manifesto of humanism. His work is kind of controversial. He falls into another whole camp at one point, and kind of says a lot of things later on that differ than what he says in this piece, but this piece ends up being significant. So if you just check it out for homework, you guys have an excerpt of it. It's called Oration on the Dignity of Man. But I'll see you in the discussion posts.